Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter were poisoned by a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. In the last hour, the Prime Minister has told MPs that it is highly likely that Russia was behind the attack. Now the Russian ambassador has been summoned to the Foreign Office and told to explain by tomorrow night how a nerve agent made its way to Salisbury. Theresa May said if there's no credible response, the government will conclude that the attack was an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. With the latest, here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Landell.
Today, police continued to examine the Salisbury home of Sergei Skripal, more than a week after the former Russian intelligence officer and his daughter were attacked with a nerve agent. A week during which it's remained unclear who carried out the crime and why. So this morning, ministers gathered for a meeting of the National Security Council looking for answers. An update on the investigation from the police and intelligence services that would allow them and the Prime Minister to decide what steps to take next. For some days, ministers have been pushing Theresa May for a tougher response. Well, this afternoon she was clear who she thought was responsible and what they should do.
It is now clear that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok. Based on the positive identification of this chemical agent by world-leading experts at the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory at Porton Down, our knowledge that Russia has previously produced this agent and would still be capable of doing so, the government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal.
She said the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, had summoned the Russian ambassador and told him he had until the end of tomorrow to explain whether this was a direct act by the Russian state or by others who now control the nerve agent.
Mr. Speaker, this attempted murder using a weapons-grade nerve agent in a British town was not just a crime against the Skripals. It was an indiscriminate and reckless act against the United Kingdom, putting the lives of innocent civilians at risk. And we will not tolerate such a brazen attempt to murder innocent civilians on our soil.
Jeremy Corbyn!
The Labour leader criticised the Conservatives for accepting money from Russian donors and called for tougher sanctions on oligarchs living in London. But
we need to continue seeking a robust dialogue with Russia on all the issues currently dividing our countries, both domestic and international, rather than simply cutting off contact and letting the tensions and divisions get worse.
Earlier today, before the statement, President Putin was visiting an agricultural centre in southern Russia and dismissed a question from the BBC's Steve Rosenberg.
President Putin, BBC News. Is Russia behind the poisoning of Sergei Skripal?
We're dealing with agriculture here, as you see, to create conditions for people's lives. And you talk to me about some tragedies. First, get to the bottom of it there, and then we'll discuss this.
But now that Russia has been blamed officially for what happened here in Salisbury, it has 24 hours to decide how to respond. James Landell, BBC News.
Well, our security correspondent Gordon Carrera is here, and the Prime Minister was very specific about the substance that was used. What exactly was it?
That's right, Sophie. She was very specific, and that was for a reason. She said it was Novichok. Now, Novichok is a form of nerve agent, a class of different type of nerve agents, developed first by the Soviet Union during the Cold War in the 1970s and 80s. And it was developed specifically to get round detection prevention systems used by the West, and even the chemical warfare suits they used to give to soldiers. Now, what will have happened is that was revealed, the existence of these Novichok agents, by defectors, and scientists at Porton Down in the laboratory for the Ministry of Defence will have been working on it, and they will have been able to match the samples that they got from the Skripals in Salisbury with the signatures that they've developed of this Novichok style of agents. Now, of course, the significance of this is that this is a specifically Russian-developed form of nerve agents. It's not like VX or sarin, other types of nerve agents, which a number of countries use. And so it's for that reason that the Prime Minister was able to say there are only two possibilities. Either the Russian state itself used it, or it somehow lost control of its own nerve agent.
Gordon Carrera, thank you. Well, in Salisbury, hundreds of police officers have been working around the clock, along with experts from the armed forces, to try to establish exactly what happened on that Sunday afternoon 8 days ago. Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford reports from Salisbury on the latest in the investigation.
The surreal scenes of chemical warfare experts in gas masks and protective suits spread out from Salisbury into the surrounding countryside today. Here they were removing a van belonging to a company that runs tow trucks. Vehicles being recovered during Operation Morlop are being taken to the nearby chemical weapons laboratory at Porton Down. So widespread is the possible contamination of this nerve agent that these specialist troops are now working in a village more than 5 miles from the centre of Salisbury. In the city itself, counter-terrorism officers, one in a balaclava, sealed off the top deck of the Sainsbury's multi-storey car park. The Prime Minister said the people of Salisbury had responded with fortitude and calmness, but there are still concerns that it took the Chief Medical Officer 7 days to give people who were in the contaminated restaurant and pub advice to wash their clothes.
The disappointment in this case is that it's taken them so long to release some information that might be of interest and might affect the individual people of Salisbury.
It is extraordinary that this medieval cathedral city has seen the deployment of one of the group of Russian military-grade nerve agents called Novichoks.
Novichoks are super nerve agents that were developed in the 80s and 90s by the Russians. Because the red lines on the use of chemical weapons have disappeared and the 100-year taboo on use have disappeared, because we've done nothing about the huge amount of use in Syria, if it is Mr. Putin, he might be feeling that he can use chemical weapons, but nobody's going to do anything about it.
Salisbury has had the air of a science fiction film these last 9 days, the scene of what the Prime Minister called today a reckless and despicable act. Much of what we've been seeing over the last few days has been decontamination work, and clearly a lot of scientific work has been done in identifying that military-grade nerve agent. But detectives are saying very little about what progress they're making in identifying the attackers themselves. Sophie.
Daniel, thank you. A circus show in the British Parliament, another information and political campaign based on propagation. That was the first response from Russia tonight. We will hear from our political editor, Laura Kunsberg, in a moment. But first, let's go to Russia. Steve Rosenberg is in Krasnodar, near the Black Sea. And they're talking about the British inventing fairy tales.
Response tonight from the Russian Foreign Ministry describing Theresa May's common statement as a circus show, dismissing the allegations against Moscow as this informational political campaign talking about fairy tales. And that is no surprise, because in recent days we've heard several Russian officials dismiss claims that Moscow is linked to this attack as anti-Russian hysteria. I think the biggest problem that Britain faces right now is the way it's perceived by the Kremlin, and it is perceived as a weak country. Moscow hears British politicians huffing and puffing, but doesn't believe they are capable of blowing the house down, in other words, of taking strong measures against Moscow. So I think the key question now, if London concludes that this was a state-sponsored act of force against Britain, what measures are Britain, perhaps together with her allies, going to take against Russia?
And Laura Kunsberg, our political editor in Westminster, it certainly was a dramatic moment in Parliament an hour or so ago, and very strong language used by the Prime Minister.
Yes, Sophie, no hedging, no fudging, no hanging back from the Prime Minister, who has essentially delivered an ultimatum to Russia to explain itself for whether or not it took direct action on British soil or whether it made a mistake and allowed this nerve agent to fall into the hands of people who shouldn't have been anywhere near it. The question, of course, as Steve suggests, what will be the government's real response if there is no credible explanation from Russia, if the Russian ambassador in London does not by Wednesday give some believable account of exactly what happened here. Theresa May was absolutely firm and serious in her words this afternoon, but the crunch may come later this week on Wednesday, whether she will be firm and serious in the actions she could take.
Koensberg in Westminster and Steve Rosenberg in Russia. Thank you both.
The day began in Salisbury with further searches in more crime scenes. But by mid-afternoon, the drama over the attack on former spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter had gone from local to global. In the Commons, Theresa May accused Moscow of an indiscriminate and reckless act against the United Kingdom, giving the Kremlin until the end of tomorrow to provide full details of its Novichok nerve gas program, or face the consequences, whatever they are. Russia has dismissed it all as a circus show. In our first report tonight is our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson.
A week and a day on, it is the attempted murder inquiry with no suspect people, only suspect places, suspected of contamination. Sergei Skripal's house cordoned from the public view at ground level. So too the restaurant Zizi, the graveyard where his wife and son lie buried, the Mill pub in Salisbury city centre. And the list of places of interest to investigators widened today: Sainsbury's supermarket, Outback, a Land Rover and masked investigator. The nation's gaze on Salisbury, where people are allowed to see nothing and know next to nothing. And out of town today, the village of Winterslow, 6 miles distant, added to this list. It's believed a vehicle was removed from this location this afternoon. And finally, in the past 2 hours, the Prime Minister said the nerve agent used was Novichok, produced in Russia since the 80s. A despicable act, she said.
The government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Mr. Speaker, there are therefore only 2 plausible explanations for what happened in Salisbury on the 4th of March. Either this was a direct act by the Russian state against our country, or the Russian government lost control of its potentially catastrophically damaging nerve agent and allowed it to get into the hands of others.
The Russian ambassador was summoned to the Foreign Office and asked to explain. The Prime Minister told the Commons Moscow has 48 hours to do so.
Should there be no credible response, we will conclude that this action amounts to an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. And I will come back to this House and set out the full range of measures that we will take in response. Mr. Speaker, this attempted murder using a weapons-grade nerve agent in a British town was not just a crime against the Skripals. It was an indiscriminate and reckless act against the United Kingdom, putting the lives of innocent civilians at risk.
In Salisbury itself, the handling of public information looks increasingly cack-handed. 6 days go by with the public being told any risk is negligible. Then suddenly hundreds of people who may have been at a variety of locations on Sunday, March the 4th, are asked to clean their clothes and wipe objects like mobile phones. And then came this morning's revelations from this man, Boris Karpichkov, another former Russian spy exiled in the UK. He claims Russian Secret Service warned him 3 weeks ago that Sergei Skripal would be killed.
First time when I was communicated this chilling message, I took it as a joke because I didn't believe.
And what was the message?
Message that something bad is going to happen with me and some other people, including Mr. Skripal, whom I have no idea before who this person is.
Who do you believe is responsible?
The Russian Secret Service, FSB specifically.
Acting on specific instructions from Vladimir Putin?
I wouldn't be so specific because I don't know whether or not it came directly from Mr. Putin, but it came from very, very senior level, close to Mr. Putin.
And Russian public opinion back home? Well, here's last night's Vesti Nedeli, one of the most popular news programs in Russia. Behind the presenter, the caption with Big Ben reads, "A deathly place." Dmitry Kislyak talking of a dangerous anti-Russian conspiracy in Britain to get momentum for an international boycott of Vladimir Putin's showpiece World Cup in Russia 3 months away. And the boss, well, in a documentary broadcast last night, President Putin was asked, "Are you able to forgive?"
Да. Не все.
А что невозможно простить?
Предательство.
But all eyes, it seems, are apparently on this deathly place come Wednesday. Then the government says it will act against what it insists is either criminal negligence by the Kremlin or just plain Kremlin crime.
Our chief correspondent Alex Thompson. Well, our political editor Gary Gibbon is in Westminster now. Fighting talk there from an embattled Prime Minister, right?
Yes, and the question will be, if it comes to action, will the action match the rhetoric? What are the consequences that Theresa May is talking about? Now, one of them is almost certainly bound to be sanctions. I'm sure the government is exploring whether they can bring additional sanctions against individuals and the Russian state. The thing about sanctions is you can bring them in as one country, but they only really have bite if you bring them in with other countries, like, for instance, our partners in the EU. And that is a process, as we've discovered over the years, that can move a bit more slowly than some would like. There's talk of sending additional troops to the Russian border with the Baltics. You don't need EU permission for that, but its effectiveness in actually pressurizing Putin might be questioned by some. There is inevitably going to be talk of some sort of expulsion of diplomats here. I doubt Theresa May will want to break off diplomatic relations altogether. Britain is seen as a country that has useful eyes and ears in Russia by some of its allies. There'll be some reluctance to do that. And frankly, diplomats are always squeamish about these expulsions because they end up with tit-for-tat expulsions and the process eventually builds up again further down the line. One diplomat was just speculating to me that just maybe Theresa May would be interested in referring Vladimir Putin to the International Criminal Court. She'd need evidence for that. She wouldn't get very far with it because Russia has a veto on the UN Security Council. But that's a possibility. Whatever happens, we'll get to hear about it. It is expected after the deadline when the National Security Council will meet on Wednesday morning, and then Theresa May will come to the Commons.
We'll be watching. Gary Gibbon, thanks very much. Well, let's go straight to Salisbury and Paul McNamara. Paul, what's the latest there on the inquiry?
Yes, evening from yet another cordoned-off section of the city. This is actually a car park that overlooks the bench where Sergei Skripal and his daughter were found. It's about 50 metres over in that direction. In fact, in the last couple of minutes, there's been a bit of a flurry of activity as another few vehicles have arrived on scene. But across Salisbury, and now in at least one outlying village, this is becoming a familiar scene as members of the military and emergency services turn up and examine vehicles. But this cordon went up this afternoon. Last night, Public Health England put out a warning to anyone that may have been in the Zizi and the pub The Mill on the day that Sergei Skripal was there a week ago to wash all of your clothes. And many people here in Salisbury are saying, why is this cordon? Why did that message? Why have they taken a week to come out? Now, Public Health England, of course, saying that there is very little risk to the public. There is no need to worry. The source of all that worry, though, today was given a name by Theresa May. Novichok, a military-grade nerve agent. And people here now want to know, how does a military-grade nerve agent arrive on UK streets? And almost more importantly, how was it delivered? Well, how was it administered to this 66-year-old former spy here in Salisbury?
Paul McNamara, thanks very much. Well, Marina Litvinenko is the widow of the former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko, who died in London after he was poisoned with polonium in 2006. She joins us now from Berlin. Thank you very much for coming on the program, Mrs. Litvinenko. You have gone through something very similar to this, worse because your husband actually died. When you hear about this, when you hear about the accusations, when you hear about the poison, what goes through your mind?
First of all, I would like to say it's happened only 1 week, and Theresa May blamed Russia behind of this crime. We were waiting almost for 10 years before we achieved a right for public inquiry, and only after verdict was released, we could say, yes, it was Russia state behind of this crime, and Theresa May have a speech in Parliament in 2016 saying exactly the same what we heard today.
So what you're saying is that you're gratified to hear the kind of tough words that you heard today from the Prime Minister that you didn't hear immediately after your husband's death in 2006.
Yes, it's not only immediately reaction, it was even some kind of preventing to bring all evidence what was collected during investigation to public. And we should fight for public inquiry to understand what actually police collected and why these two suspects, we know this name, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, who killed my husband, and now they are in Russia, and even more, Andrei Lugovoy is a member of parliament of Russian Duma, and everything what we have since investigation of death of my husband, it looks like was not done enough, and now we have a very similar case in Salisbury.
So what kind of actions would you like to see this government take if the Russians don't come back with a suitable explanation tomorrow night, and if it is proved beyond any reasonable doubt that they were responsible?
I need to be very accurate to give any advice, because I'm a personal, emotionally involved in this case, and I don't like to push people to do something extra or very hard, but it's absolutely right things to make a personal sanctions against people who've been involved in such crime and who've been involved in financial crime. And how do we know? It's some kind of law already used in United States. It's Magnitsky law. Few countries in Europe already joined the same Magnitsky law, but only UK not involved. And I would say some kind of things we have to do here in UK.
Do you think that if the British government had been tougher after the death of your husband, had spoken the kind of words that we heard today, and actually followed up with real consequences, that this current poisoning might have been avoided?
No, it's again, when we've been preventing to have a public inquiry, and one point it was is a relationship. And I could see how a British government tried very hard to save this relationship after knowledge. Polonium, what was used to kill my husband, was from Russia. These two agents were from Russia. But British government tried to do it very hard, because Russia every time play a main role in a world. Particularly we had Syria, involvement in Russia in this process was every time very important. And I just don't like if might happen something similar, and it would be decision again to save this vault and just make this all easy.
Got to leave it there. Marina Litvinenko, thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. Well, from Westminster is Conservative MP Tom Tugendhat, Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Welcome to the programme, Tom Tugendhat. Prime Minister, again, as we said earlier, tough talk today in the Commons. She threatened consequences if we don't get a suitable explanation by tomorrow night. What will they be, those consequences?
Well, the Prime Minister has a range of options at her disposal, Matt, from tightening of sanctions to particularly more targeted sanctions, including sanctions on some of the individuals who are connected to the Kremlin, whether directly or through immediate family, which give cause for concern. So there's a whole range of things she can do, and she also spoke very clearly about working with allies. This is a moment at which working with allies is particularly important, of course, because if we're looking to put sanctions on a regime and those who support it, then making sure that they apply as widely as possible is important.
I'm curious that we haven't heard from quite a number of those allies. In fact, there's a bit of a deafening silence. Berlin, which has been, at the forefront of sanctions against Russia after Crimea, hasn't said anything yet. Paris hasn't said anything yet. We're only just getting some reaction from Washington. Does that worry you, that we seem a bit isolated at the moment?
No, Matt, it's not surprising at all. The Prime Minister's only just made her statement to the House, which details the incident and points the finger so squarely at Moscow, either deliberately, as she said, or accidentally, because it's losing control of the regime and the chemical weapon stocks. So it's hardly surprising that none of our allies have made a comment, because they wouldn't until they had an official statement from government on this.
But, I mean, the Prime Minister, in her very tough statement, says that Russia is the highly likely culprit. That is kind of, it opens the door to some doubt. At the same time, you've got the Kremlin saying that this is a circus show and a bit of a fairy tale. What's your response to that?
Well, Matt, she was extremely clear. She said the source is clearly weapons-grade chemical weapons from Russia. She said the manufacturing was clearly Russian, and therefore she pointed the finger very clearly at Russia. The only thing she said was in any form of doubt was either the Kremlin is losing control of its chemical weapon stocks, in which case it is a very dangerous country, or it is the Kremlin itself that ordered it, in which case it is a very rogue regime.
But they're rather different things, aren't they? If there is gross negligence here, do you think that sanctions or stepping up the pressure in some form is the appropriate way to respond?
Well, that's why she's waiting until she hears back from the Russian ambassador, because it's absolutely essential that we find out what the truth is before we respond. And I very much welcome the fact that the ambassador has been summoned, because the behaviour of the Russian state at worst is criminal and at best is criminally irresponsible.
Do we really think that whatever measures she comes up with, let's say, stepped up sanctions, will work when the sanctions already in place from the European Union after Crimea have not done a single thing to alter Russia's policy? Well, Russia seems to be basically getting away with bombing civilians in Syria, and none of the condemnation that's come from this part of the world has made any difference at all.
Well, Matt, you're pointing to the fact that we need to work much better together on this, and indeed you're absolutely right that we need to make sure that we target much more accurately those who are responsible. One of the problems with sanctions is that it has been too widespread in that too many ordinary people are affected by the sanctions. What we need to do is we need to target those sanctions at the individuals who are the acolytes, the aristocrats, if you like, of the new Kremlin aristocracy, and we need to make sure that their life of luxury, having been which they have stolen off the Russian people over 20 years, is stopped. I mean, people like Putin have accumulated hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assets, and that they cannot be left to enjoy them.
Okay, got to leave it there. Tom Tugendhat, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Matt.
A quick reminder of tonight's main news. Theresa May has declared the Kremlin is the highly likely culprit behind the nerve agent attack in Salisbury. And in the last few minutes, the White House press secretary has offered the UK its support.
The use of a highly lethal nerve agent against UK citizens on UK soil is an outrage. The attack was reckless, indiscriminate, and irresponsible. We offer the fullest condemnation, and we extend our sympathy to the victims and their families and our support to the UK government. We stand by our closest ally in the special relationship that we have.
And the government expects a response tomorrow night by the Russians. If not, there will be consequences, as we were told.
It was you, the Prime Minister told the Russians today. One way or another, she explained to the House of Commons it was highly likely Russia was responsible for the attack on one of its former spies in Salisbury 8 days ago. Either it was a direct attack by the Russian state, she said, or the state itself had lost control of what was a military-grade nerve agent. She gave Russia until tomorrow night to explain which, or else what? Well, she'll decide that on Wednesday, but her response could include extensive measures, she said.
And so this appears to have been a state-sponsored assassination attempt after all. A new police cordon at a supermarket in Salisbury tonight. This an investigation with unlikely locations, but a predictable suspect. After Litvinenko, it took a decade for the government to get to this point.
Order. Statement, the Prime Minister.
But now, 8 days on, Theresa May has blamed Russia. In her hands, one of the most remarkable statements she's delivered as Prime Minister, and with every moment on her feet, the diplomatic tension escalating.
It is now clear that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok.
It's for investigators to establish who had the means, the motive, the opportunity to launch a poison attack. The Prime Minister said they'd come to a conclusion.
The government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal.
The attack on the former spy and his daughter also left a police officer seriously ill. The Prime Minister said if Russia was not responsible, it had somehow lost control of its nerve agent, and it has until Wednesday to explain.
Should there be no credible response, we will conclude that this action amounts to an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. And I will come back to this House and set out the full range of measures that we will take in response.
She said Britain was ready to take action.
Jeremy Corbyn.
But the Labour leader warned against ending diplomatic ties.
We need to continue seeking a robust dialogue with Russia on all the issues currently dividing our countries, both domestic and international, rather than simply cutting off contact and letting the tensions and divisions get worse and potentially even more dangerous.
Novichok is the name for a family of nerve agents said to be the most deadly ever created. It was developed by the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s. It's believed to be up to 8 times more potent than the VX nerve agent and can be administered as an ultra-fine powder. When inhaled or absorbed into the skin, it causes suffocation and heart failure.
If they're inhaled or they're touched onto the skin, what they do is they affect the nervous system, much like we've seen with the sarin, sadly, in recent events in Syria. It involves a poisoning of the nervous system, which makes you go into convulsions.
And so Britain looks towards its closest friends.
Good afternoon.
But one word was missing from this White House response. It failed to explicitly condemn or even to mention Russia.
We extend our sympathy to the victims and their families and our support to the UK government. We stand by our closest ally in the special relationship that we have.
So you're not saying that Russia was behind this attack?
Right now, we are standing with our UK ally. I think they're still working through even some of the details of that.
What happened in this cathedral city 2 Sundays ago might yet become a test of NATO's resolve. Britain has demanded a response from Russia, knowing its appetite for retaliation will be far greater. Officials in London suspect that this was a row that Putin wanted. Rohit Katru, News at 10.
So the Prime Minister has warned more extensive measures could be taken against Russia. What could that mean, and how frightening is it really for the Russians themselves? Well, the government could increase sanctions, although many were already put in place after Russian intervention in Syria and Ukraine. The finances of more of those linked to the Russian government could be frozen, or of course we could start expelling some of Russia's diplomats here, or even, I suppose, sever relations entirely between our two countries. That doesn't seem especially likely. Our political editor Robert Peston is here. Look, Robert, this doesn't get more serious than this, does it? An attack directly on our soil. What do you make of the measures we could potentially take here?
So just to be clear, talking to ministers, they don't think it's remotely plausible that President Putin has lost control over the production of this awful toxin. They do think this is an attack by the Russian state, and therefore on Wednesday they will be announcing a response. What they are balancing is something that he takes seriously against keeping enough in reserve so that when he retaliates, which they expect him to, they can do more. So some diplomats will be expelled, but not the ambassador. I think some Russians in some way connected to this atrocity will be deemed non grata. They won't be allowed to come to the country. Their assets here will be frozen. But the reality is that action against Russia would be massively more effective if it can be done in conjunction with other countries. So we're talking to America. But of course, crucially, we are talking to the rest of the European Union. And the big question is whether they feel alienated from us as a result of Brexit, such that they aren't listening to us sufficiently about the gravity of what's happening. Now, my own view is that ultimately the EU will rally round because they do want a common security approach after we leave the EU. So I think there will be common action with the EU, but it may not be as fast as she'd like.
Well, we saw the Prime Minister in the Commons today. We also saw the Leader of the Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, and he's come in for a bit of flack tonight for his response to this.
So he was seen to be playing party politics, attacking the government for not adopting a Labour plan to increase powers to take sanctions in these sorts of cases, but also saying that he didn't want action that would increase tensions with Russia. Now, pretty much all the backbenchers, Labour backbenchers who stood up, basically said we've got to show solidarity with the government, and that was a very direct criticism of him. Now, for me, the most interesting question is he's always done things differently. Typically, British people don't seem to care, but I think British people are concerned about what they see as an attack on British soil, and they might not, for the very first time, quite like what they're hearing from Jeremy Corbyn.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed. Well, you may not be surprised to hear that Russia is having none of any of this. Its leaders were scathing today, to put it mildly. Russia's foreign ministry called Mrs May's statement a circus show in the British Parliament. They certainly haven't been to the Parliament if they're confusing it with the circus, but never mind. Show us the evidence, they insisted.
Tonight, the Kremlin hit back at the Prime Minister hard, authorising Russia's foreign ministry to label Mrs May's statement as a circus full of tales. Andrei Lugovoy, the man Britain believes murdered Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko, said tonight it was all part of a plan to discredit Russia.
I do not have any doubts that this is a well-planned hysteria, a PR campaign being run according to tried and tested scenarios. They've chosen a person with particular past, so that no one has any doubt that he is not just related to Russia, but is also a traitor.
Until now, the Russian public has not heard much about the Skripal attack, but that is changing as Putin loyalists respond angrily to the Prime Minister's statement.
Theresa May in a very weak political position, and maybe she try because of Brexit, because Northern Ireland issue and so on. Maybe she want to rely on some patriotic atmosphere or patriotic hysteria in British society. Stop. Don't do it.
There has been no word yet as to how the Kremlin might respond to any British measures against Russia, only a hint that they would. The Russian authorities say the government is playing a dangerous game, politicising the Skripal investigation and threatening to wreck UK-Russia relations. Earlier, President Putin himself spoke about the Skripal attack, but only to say that he would discuss it when Britain had got to the bottom of it. This interview in a documentary apparently filmed before the attack was more illuminating. Are you able to forgive, he is asked. Yes, but not everything. What is impossible to forgive? Betrayal is his one-word answer. And with Mrs May sounding equally unforgiving of what appear to be the actions of the Russian government, relations between the two sides are rapidly chilling.
We have then laid down the gauntlet. Russia must respond by tomorrow night, or else. So, in all seriousness, how worried are the Russians by this? Or to put it another way, is there anything we, or the rest of Europe, or even the Americans could do that would genuinely unsettle them? Well, Carl is joining us live from Moscow tonight. I mean, Carl, what's your sense of that? What could we do, what might we do that would genuinely unsettle the Russian president?
Well, whatever I think Mrs May announces on Wednesday, and I think she will be announcing measures on Wednesday, I don't believe for a moment that Russia will have explained all this away by then. I think Russia will respond in kind, so sanctions for sanctions, expulsions for expulsions. As Robert was saying a few moments ago, to really have an impact, you need to get the European Union involved, because the EU is by far and away Russia's biggest trading partner. But the truth is that there have already been much bigger, frankly, crises than this. The invasion of Crimea, the bringing down of the MH17 airliner. The EU has brought in sanctions, and Russia is still behaving the way that it is. And that is in large part because those sanctions haven't included Russia's biggest export to the EU, oil and gas, simply because too many EU countries are reliant. So I don't see that changing. I don't see a World Cup boycott happening. That's been pretty much ruled out. So we are left with more targeted sanctions and possibly the so-called Magnitsky Act to target Russian oligarchs who are linked to Vladimir Putin. Will that make a difference to him? I'm not so sure.
OK, Carl, well, let's wait for the middle of the week and see. Thank you very much indeed. Now, in Salisbury itself today, the scene of the crime, more places were added to the list of either suspicious or potentially dangerous sites, which is prompting people there to wonder why on earth is this only happening now, more than a week on.
Wrapped in plastic and ready for forensic examination, a parking machine, likely to have been used by hundreds of people since the chemical weapons attack, is now possibly contaminated itself. Was it used by the victims who were poisoned but hadn't yet felt the appalling effects? This is the city centre, yards from the bench where two critically ill people were found slumped. This car park has been open ever since the chemical attack happened. So why today, 8 days on, it has become a site of interest is unclear, but it's also unnerving. The very fact that they're taking equipment for personal protection and safety into a place that has been open to the public for the last 8 days will have some people wondering what is going on here. Despite numerous locations being searched and made safe, sources close to the investigation have told ITV News that detectives believe that Sergei Skripal and his daughter were targeted in or around their home. With so many sites in the spotlight, there are questions about how safe people really are. Last Wednesday, Public Health England said the risk to health was low, giving no official guidance. Traces of the nerve agent have since reportedly been found on and around the table they ate at, which is said to have been destroyed to stop further contamination. Then yesterday, Public Health England issued official guidance, telling up to 500 people who'd visited Zizi's and the Mill pub that day to wash their clothes and belongings, which they say is just a precautionary measure. Steve Cooper's taking no chances, sealing up his clothes. He was in the Mill pub at the same time as the former spy and sat on the bench earlier the same day. He's unnerved by everything that's happened since.
Well, that's the distressing part. Also that we've had no direct contact from any of the authorities that have said, if you're in the area, here's a number to call for us to give you the advice. Because since then I've been to visit some customers, I've been to my company and met with my colleagues, and they're now scattered far and wide around the world.
From the centre of a quiet village where a van was delicately lifted and taken away today, to crime scenes in the centre of the city. The chemical weapon has been deployed and its impact is now reaching out around the globe. Rupert Evelyn, News at 10, Salisbury.
We know now that we're in a diplomatic standoff. The Russians have been given 24 hours to provide an explanation of how one of their nerve agents ended up on British streets. An ultimatum then, after an act of apparently shocking recklessness.
It's not a new strategy for Russia, for the breadcrumbs, so to speak, to lead back to the Kremlin. The part of this is revenge, but the bigger part is really about delivering a message to Russians inside Russia, to Putin's own electorate in advance of the elections, and his security services, who are enabling him to remain in power.
As investigators took samples late last week, the diagnosis of Britain's chemical warfare community became clearer and clearer. A nerve agent, part of a family nicknamed Novichok in the old Soviet Union, highly potent and very hard to detect. The Prime Minister today called out Russia.
On Wednesday, we will consider in detail the response from the Russian state. Should there be no credible response, we will conclude that this action amounts to an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. And I will come back to this House and set out the full range of measures that we will take in response. Mr. Speaker, this attempted murder using a weapons-grade nerve agent in a British town was not just a crime against the Skripals. It was an indiscriminate and reckless act against the United Kingdom, putting the lives of innocent civilians at risk.
So what of Russia's response? Before Theresa May's statement, BBC correspondent Steve Rosenberg caught up with Vladimir Putin electioneering in southern Russia.
Is Russia behind the poisoning of Sergei Skripal?
Get to the bottom of things there and then we'll discuss it, came the reply. Novichok is actually a family of about 100 nerve agents developed as the Soviet Union was on its last legs. The chemical principles involved are well understood in other labs, but the processes and constituent chemicals create a highly distinctive signature.
It is possible to determine the exact structure of the molecule. Because of that, it is possible to determine which precursors were used in the manufacture of that agent. It is possible, because of the knowledge about the precursors, to reconstruct the method of synthesis. And these are telltale signs like your fingerprints.
As the clock ticks away on Theresa May's ultimatum to the Russians, the wires will be burning between the Foreign Office and allied ministries across Europe and of course the State Department in the United States. What the UK will be trying to find out is how much support there is, whether solidarity in backing Britain in its calls for sanctions against Russia extends beyond the rhetorical. The Prime Minister did leave one possible route out for the Kremlin, alluding to the possibility that Novichok, a banned weapon in any case, might have been used without government authorization.
It could be that it was stolen or sold at an earlier date to another entity, in which case the question is what's happening, why would that have happened, what is the security here, how could this have been allowed to happen? That's a very different set of questions to actual state use.
But if Russia continues to deny everything, Britain will likely by Wednesday afternoon be asking its allies to endure the pain of applying new sanctions.
This is a threat that certainly came to fruition in the UK. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't happen in other Western countries, and I think together we need to take action, whether it comes in the form of declaring Russian officials persona non grata in the UK or sanctions against specific Russians. Again, there's a cost that we'll pay. But if we don't pay a bit of a cost right now, we may pay more in the future.
This then is developing into a fully fledged diplomatic crisis, and Britain soon could be putting forward a whole raft of new measures against Russia.
Well, that was Mark Urban. What response from the Russians tonight? Putin has brushed off the question, as you heard, saying the British need to get to the bottom of it first. Their foreign ministry called it a circus show. Joining us now, Amy Knight, a world expert on the KGB, and Sir Tony Brenton, British ambassador to Moscow until 2008. Very nice to have you both here. I'm going to start with you, Amy Knight, if I can. Theresa May laid out those two options today in the Commons, the Russian state or a rogue perpetrator that's borrowed the agent. What do you sense this is?
I think that the Kremlin will undoubtedly not admit that it was the Russian state that committed this act. But I think the likelihood that rogue elements got a hold of this nerve gas and were able to transport it or bring all the precursors and make this, I think it's highly unlikely. The FSB is the agency that's in charge of these sophisticated laboratories that do this, and it's really unlikely that this would have happened.
Mark was espousing some of the theories of what might have happened on that day. Do you think this went according to plan, or did something go wrong?
Well, I was surprised by the fact that this substance actually was allowed to damage other people and put people in hospital, and even Skripal's daughter. But, if you look back at the Litvinenko poisoning, that was also handled very carelessly. And we know that the two gentlemen were hired by the FSB to poison Litvinenko. So, yeah, I was surprised at the lack of professionalism, if you will, but presumably this can happen.
But you still think that Putin's fingerprints are ultimately on this, or you think it might have been people acting, believing it was what he would have required?
That isn't the way things operate. People, I've heard this theory before in regard to other crimes and so forth. This kind of action would not have been taken without the explicit approval of Mr. Putin. Now, of course, there'll never be a smoking gun because that's not the way things work. And he'll just continue to deny and deny and deny, and I'm sure they'll say that they will investigate it and try to get to the bottom of things. But as you know, Mr. Putin and his very close colleagues control all of the investigative organs. So there's no possibility of Russia having any kind of an independent investigation of the circumstances of this poisoning.
Let me just pick up on that point then with Tony Brenton. What does Russia do now? If you were in that Foreign Office meeting tomorrow, would you expect the Russian ambassador to turn up, and what would you expect them to say?
Well, I'm sure he'll turn up, and what he'll say is, we didn't do it, and we don't believe that anybody from our side did it either. It's pretty clear that we're going to get a negative response from the Russians, and indeed the question has been put to them in a way calculated to get a negative response.
So you think Theresa May has taken a gamble here, or has she played a blinder? I guess the real question is, does Russia care? Are they spooked by this at all?
Well, those are two different questions. I don't think Theresa May has taken a gamble. She's responding entirely properly to an outrageous attack on the UK. Do the Russians care? Well, that depends quite a lot on how we now respond. That we've got a range of sanctions at our disposal. We can make life very uncomfortable for the Russian intelligence agencies operating in the UK. We can hit Russian money in the city. But I think the crucial question is how much support we can get from our allies. Our action by itself will do some damage and affect some Russians' thinkings. If the West act unitedly, then that will have a much bigger impact.
And we are pretty much alone at the moment. We haven't, from the looks of it, got Trump coming to our aid. We haven't got the EU necessarily rallying round at this point, have we?
No, I mean, I was ambassador at the time of the Litvinenko affair, and the precedent of lack of allied support from then is pretty disappointing. The Americans were disposed to be helpful, but the Europeans in particular were not, over and beyond rhetoric. Now, the political situation has changed a lot since then. We're much more, all of the West, at loggerheads with the Russians than we were back in 2006. So there's more scope for persuading our Western partners. This has happened on our streets today, it will be on your streets tomorrow. But an awful lot comes down to the skill and professionalism and persuasiveness of British diplomats and ministers over the next few days.
And Amy Knight, do you think that Donald Trump will have to start taking this seriously? Will he have to come out against the Russians if this is clearly where it leads?
Well, you know, I think it's interesting the timing of this incident. Not only did it occur 2 weeks before the Russian presidential election, but also it's occurred at a time when the Trump administration is totally caught up in scandals. So I think, first of all, the Trump administration is very distracted, so they're not likely to be able to react as well as they might if things were going smoothly in the White House. And secondly, of course, we know that Donald Trump has bent over backwards to apologize for everything that Vladimir Putin has done. And he has gone on record as saying that he doesn't believe that Putin ever commits any kind of political killings. So I think it's unlikely that we're going to get any initiative from Trump. That said, of course, there are people, you know, in the White House and in the Congress who have been very, you know, proactive when it comes to this kind of thing. So we might see something from them. But I hesitate to say that it's going to be as strong as it might be if we had an administration that was much more realistic about Russia.
Amy Knight, Tony Brenton, thank you both.
So Kevin and Andrew with their thoughts, and certainly the deadline given by Theresa May to President Putin all over the newspapers this evening. Will she get a response?
Yeah, just over 24 hours to go. She talked tough in the House of Commons. Will she act tough if Putin calls her bluff? I hope she's worked this one through and looked at all the moves ahead. And according to the Times, they say there may be a cyber attack on Russia. Now, that's, should we say, bold or reckless to do that. You lose any moral authority if you want to do it. You've got to act in some way. But do you want to escalate this? If you launch a cyber attack, they launch one back. Often been accused in the past of doing them. I suspect our security services are at it too. We're now getting a glimpse into a very dirty world of spying. But a cyber attack?
Well, if you going to do that? If you read the paragraph, the Ministry of Defence, the Times says, and GCHQ are working to accelerate a joint offensive cyber programme. They go on to say that any targets could include Kremlin computer networks or websites publishing fake news and the output from state-sponsored cyber troll factories. Now, the world would probably cheer if they cleared up the fake news sites and the troll factories.
Just go on to Twitter and Facebook. You'd probably sort that out. You don't need to launch a cyber attack.
But the worry is it a
a more extensive cyber attack, and does it impact on hospitals and factories and schools, in which case...
Do you think they'd really do that?
Well, I hope not, but
it's a dangerous game.
Because she has got the moral high ground, Prime Minister. I thought she spoke very authoritatively in the Commons, but I still think that the easiest way to do is to target these rich Russians who want to come backwards and forwards, who want to do business here, and there are ways they can do that. There is the law allows that now, and of course there is the question of the World Cup. Now, my own newspaper tonight has we've got a fascinating joint double spread in the paper. So Stephen Glover, one of our more illustrious columnists, is saying, how can we possibly go to Putin's World Cup? And we also have an article from the editor of Bild, the biggest selling newspaper in Germany, Julian Reichelt, saying exactly the same thing. And he makes the point, very telling point actually, that in Germany, better than anybody, they know all too well how evil regimes can exploit sport, because Adolf Hitler hosted the Olympic Games in Germany in 1936. Jesse Owens, of course, the great black runner, upset the form book for the Nazis by winning gold in the sprints, which was terrific. But there is no doubt Hitler exploited that for great propaganda gain. And Putin, be under no illusion, would exploit the World Cup too for political advantage. I mean, it is astonishing that they got the World Cup in the first place.
Yeah.
All sorts of
and
allegations.
so soon after the Winter Olympics as well.
All sorts of allegations about money being handed over. Qatar got the Olympics 4 years later.
The World Cup.
World Cup 4 years later. And of course, the point the Mail made at the time when there was the great battle to get the World Cup in 1918, Prince William was wheeled out by the government, David Cameron, to try and get the Olympics for England, and he should not have been involved in any of that horse trading with a dodgy international football organisation run by a man called Sepp Blatter, who got this World Cup for Putin.
Yeah. Putin has many faults. He's a thug, kind of gangster capitalism.
He's KGB.
He's been around the world. He's got a foreign policy you would recoil against, although I think some of the things we've done in the UK and the Americans, I condemn too. However, he isn't Adolf Hitler. I'd rather go through the list of economic and financial sanctions you can put on individuals in and around his regime. The government seems to now be...
But if you start to look at the charge sheet, it's growing, isn't it? If you think about annexation of territory for the first time since the Second World War in Crimea...
But to go, before you're taking and freezing more assets in London, you're telling footballers and fans they can't go to the World Cup. I think that's a big jump.
No, you do both.
Margaret Thatcher attempted to organise a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Didn't succeed with Britain. Americans didn't go, and quite a few other countries didn't go. That was because of the invasion of Afghanistan by the Russians. Of course, the US and UK later invaded ourselves.
Why can't you do both?
No, it worked.
Do both, what do you mean?
You go for the financial assets and you go for the sporting boycott too, because it would hurt his pride. And this man is a very proud leader.
You sacrifice all those England football players and all those sports stars.
Yeah, I do. Because the football tournament is discredited by the mere fact it's being held in a pariah state that's broken all sorts of international laws and is corrupt.
You'd have to pull out...
But hang on, if Germany came on side too...
You think they will?
Well, maybe they will.
You'd then on football, you'd have to pull out clubs playing in Russia and the Europa League and the Champions League.
Do we want to take on Putin or not, Kevin?
Well, you do, but that doesn't mean you boycott the World Cup. I can see... Well, I was never really bothered whether Prince William was going or not, but I can see we won't send him. I remember David Cameron didn't go to the Sochi Olympics. That hurt Putin a bit because he wanted that. He wanted the show of world leaders.
But the whole point is now, given what's happening to the UK, if you take unilateral action and nobody joins in, you look weak as a nation, and this is the danger. For the UK.
Right.
And what happens with Theresa May?
Look, we've had a very interesting. The
right.
German newspaper Bild is very influential. Who knows? Maybe that will start public opinion moving.
Well, that's about Syria, they said. I spoke to the guy earlier, and he said you'd have the embarrassing moment where one of our nations, England or Germany, might go up to collect the trophy from Putin. I didn't like to say it's more likely to be Germany at that point.
Most unlikely it'll be England.
Yeah, but do you shake the hands of Putin at that point? Because they're worried about chemical weapon attacks in Syria.
His hand is bloodstained. He's a bloodstained dictator. He's an ex-KGB man who's never changed his spots. He's a brutal thug. Journalists get murdered all the time in Russia and locked up in jails. And so why would our England team want to go and play that?
You've just, you know, if you want bloodstained...
Kevin, I'm sorry that you want to support this man, like your great leader, Jeremy Corbyn, at the Dispatch box today, who did not want to condemn Russia and wanted to use it as an opportunity to make cheap points about donations. But actually, I think this man is a monster, and I don't think we should be having to do with him.
If you're worried about shaking blood-soaked hands, you would not have Theresa May and half the cabinet shaking the hand of the Saudi tyrant when Mohammed bin Salman came last week, selling him arms.
I don't think he's assassinating people on British soil, Kevin. He's not assassinating people on British soil.
He's killing innocent people.
And he's also employing tens of thousands of people in Labour-held constituencies in the aerospace and armaments.
There we are.
So, Kevin, you tell all those mates of yours in those Labour constituencies, you can all lose your job.
Look, you can all
lose your job. I'll do business with Putin, says Kevin Maguire, but not with the Saudi dictator. Funny priorities, Maguire.
The more you shout,
funny priorities.
The more you shout, the less sense you make.
Funny priorities, Kevin.
The more you shout, the less sense you make.
You're going to lose billions of pounds worth of jobs, but you're going to carry on doing business with Putin, and we hardly have any economic trade with Putin.
I'm the one who's arguing you've got to calibrate a response. The problem, you're quite right, that if we don't do anything, we look weak. If you do something and it doesn't work, you look weak too. You are weak, particularly if you can't take other countries with you. You need a concerted action, and you get weak points. I want Britain to remain in the European Union. But I can see that Germany, both in the European Union and in NATO, will take a different view, not least because it's dependent on Russian gas for power. We're fortunate we're not in the same way. But you've got to take action. But I like the way you've just jumped straight to the World Cup.
Well, look, you know, the editor of Bild is a very influential man. He's written a very powerful article in the paper. I think you should read it, Kevin. It might change your views on Putin.
Yeah, you might
and doing business within the World Cup.
No, I will read it, but that doesn't mean I'm going to agree with it.
No, you don't have to.
No, sporting sanctions did work, combined with economic sanctions, including a UN oil embargo in South Africa and bringing down apartheid. So it can work at times. Other times, you do have to reach out and you've got to engage in some way, and you've got to carry on relations. It's tricky.
Yeah.
But you've got to get it right. I really hope she's thought this through.
Yeah. I mean, the difficulty is that the EU brought in a lot of sanctions, didn't it, in 2016, targeting individuals, nearly 150, targeting the state-owned banks, for example, so the financial sanctions are there, all under the guise of the European Union. What do we do next? Who do we bring on board? She's already spoken to President Macron tonight, for example. Rex Tillerson, the US Secretary of State, said it is most likely Russia, and this will trigger a response, which is slightly better than we heard from the White House press spokeswoman earlier.
Yeah, well, she's got 24 hours to get on with it, and because let's not say let's be certain. I mean, whatever Putin says, he'll lie. It's a diplomatic challenge for the government, and I'm sure she's going to get there.
Yeah, and a slow reaction.
I like the way that just complete blank check confidence. I'm sure she'll.
Well,
get there.
I think she spoke very well. She was very self-assured in the Commons today. Jeremy Corbyn was appalling, and I think,
as you say all the time.
Yeah, well, he was appalling, Kevin, and a lot of your Labour MPs thought so too.
And many of those people who've been sent to wash their clothes are slightly perturbed by the slow response.
Well, you've got this organisation called Public Health England. I think it's got a budget of around £4 billion a year, and it took a week to tell people they should clean their clothes, clean their jewellery. I mean, she's the chief medical officer. She's always lecturing the country about drinking too much wine or not doing enough exercise. And yet here's a genuine public health issue in Salisbury, and they're a week late.
Tory boy, if you gave complete and utter confidence in Theresa May and somehow handling Vladimir Putin, well, she is Prime Minister of our country, and they haven't covered themselves in glory in Salisbury. So I just think, let's see. I'll be a bit more critical than you on this.
I've been